Okay, I think it's too dark. You think it's too dark?
No, I like it.
All right, we're going to do this Rembrandt style. Eh, okay, so it is Monday,
Mhm.
January
Third, I think.
3rd. Okay, so we're going to switch it up a little bit here tonight. For one thing, I have my mic on, trying to improve my audio. I had this stuff laying around. I just haven't been using it because I'm lazy. I mean, I don't care about quality. But anyway, here we go. We'll see if this works. If this doesn't work, we'll make adjustments. Second, I usually talk about climate change on here predominantly, mostly, but that's not the only crisis we have going on. There's also this pandemic thingy that has garnered a lot of interest, as well it should. Um, I don't normally have much to say about uh, the pandemic. My wife and I are just staying home. We're sort of sitting it out. So there's no real drama for us about that topic. It hasn't really changed our life a great deal. And uh, so it's not really on our mind much, except for what we see in the media. However, I am still a scientist. I'm still interested in biology, and I'm interested in sort of what's happening with the virus and the pandemic and how that stuff evolves. We don't biologists don't get much opportunity to have exposure to these sorts of events because they're kind of rare. There was the big influenza outbreak in 1918, um, back when the science of disease spread was pretty incomplete, and we learned a lot from that actually, and it forwarded the science a great deal. In fact, a lot of what we now take for granted, uh, you know, uh, uh, the common wisdom about epidemics and pandemics, what actually came from the 1918 pandemic. So now we have a pandemic. Here we are. We're dealing with this. And I was watching, I don't know if I was watching a video or if I was on CNN, uh, and someone was trying to explain about something. There's something special about the Omicron variant and how it's getting more lethal and more dangerous, and that's because of evolution. I was thinking, wait, no, that's not actually. I don't think that's how evolution works. What they just described, and they're attributing the virulence of Omicron to uh, to evolution. Um, so I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I should be able to figure this out. So I'm going to explain something, a little something, uh, put some context around uh, where this pandemic ultimately is going. Not tomorrow, not with vaccines, not with lockdowns and school closures. I'm not talking about all that hoo-ha. Okay, I'm talking about where biologically where this thing is going, and it's going to the same place that all pandemics go. It's going to essentially burn itself out. Now, one way, okay, a couple of definitions here. One way that a disease burns itself out, meaning it just sort of fizzles in the end, like a fire that can't find any more fuel. All right, it's burned everything it can burn. Now it's burning upon itself. It's burning its own ashes, and now it runs out of fuel and it dies. Okay, it just puts itself out. So the way a pandemic or an epidemic, a pandemic is just a much bigger epidemic. Okay, the way an epidemic or special case a pandemic puts itself out is everybody gets sick. Some people die, depending on how virulent or lethal the pathogen is. But everybody gets sick. Some people die. Okay, they're out of the story. People who don't die become immune in some way or another. And then when the virus is going through the population, spreading, it actually keeps running into people who have already seen the virus, and it can't grow in those people. And since it can't grow in those people, it can't multiply and spread to new people. And even if it does spread to a new person, that person is also immune because, like I said, the definition of the end of a pandemic is that everybody's immune. So it just fizzles out, it just burns itself out. That's one way that a virus dies. Now, these coronaviruses are special. Let me just say right away that some pathogens like smallpox and polio, and I want to say tuberculosis, that's not a virus, but um, some pathogens, when you're exposed to them, and including when you get your childhood immunizations, right? Measles, sometimes when you're exposed to them, your body learns essentially lifelong immunity, certainly long enough that you're no longer a child and the illness won't hurt you anymore, okay, even if you get it, but a lot of times you don't, right? So childhood immunization it is good for basically your whole life. It's not quite true, but you don't get them again. You don't get those immunizations again. You should be fine. And even something like the tetanus immunization inoculation. If your doctor feels like you need to get the tetanus inoculation, you only have to get it every 10 years or so, I think. The actual length of time varies as they do more research, but I think it's up to 10 years now. I could be wrong, but it's a long time. Okay. So some of these pathogens, when you get sick with them, you're done with them and it's done with you. So if a big part of the population comes in contact with the pathogen, survives, the immunity so incurred by that person is with them for a long time. And now as the pathogen goes around the population, it comes back to you. Well, you've seen it already. It can't even get started. It enters your system and says, "Oh no," and it dies. And when immunity so acquired will stay with you for many years or even your entire life, then that pathogen is done. At some point, it just burns itself out and it's finished. But that's not the only way that these things work. There's another possible fate for a virus that's making the rounds. And the fate of that virus is that it evolves. We can't really completely get rid of it. It doesn't really completely take over the entire population and burn itself out. Okay, it just kind of it, and yet, even though we can't completely escape it and it can't completely immunize us, we end up in this really weird gray area where it just keeps coming back and coming back and coming back and coming back. But as it travels through time with us, it evolves. So let me explain how that works. It evolves in the direction of becoming essentially irrelevant. And what an irrelevant virus looks like is the common cold. The common cold. So let me explain to you how that works. So immunity to coronaviruses in general, as a class of viruses, human immunity to coronaviruses in general, it doesn't work very well. We're able to fight them off, but the parts of the immune system that are supposed to remember having seen this thing and fought it off and remember that for next time, it's weak. Our ability to retain immunity is weak. And you're even seeing this with the discussions of the current vaccines being used to fight COVID-19, that particular coronavirus. You need 2 shots. They have to be spaced a certain way apart, and then you need boosters. And there was talk all along about how long would immunity even be inferred by these, is the right word, incurred? By these vaccines. Is it so short-lived? Is the immunity so short-lived that it's practically useless, right? These were real questions. These remain real questions because we're talking about a coronavirus, okay? And coronaviruses tend to not be remembered by the body. Our body, having seen the virus and fighting it off and being successful at that, it doesn't really remember how to do that later. So that virus can come back. Now, that's bad news for the current actions to fight this pandemic and win over the COVID-19 and defeat the virus, all this stuff. And it also, that reality that these things are really hard, stubborn. They keep coming. It helps to explain why politicians and, I should say, world leaders and leaders in the healthcare field really want a lot of people to get vaccinated all at once for the entire population. That is really how it has to happen with these coronaviruses. Everybody has to get immunized at once, and it has to be everybody. Because the immunity so incurred, okay, as your body will remember that it fought off the virus. The current crop of vaccines are not really, they don't really work that way. You're only being vaccinated against a tiny fraction of the virus's protein complex, just the spike proteins. But it doesn't matter. If your body can recognize the spike proteins, then it essentially recognizes the whole virus, right? So the idea is we train the body's immune system to the spike proteins, and that's good enough, okay? So, and you know, let's be fair, the way the body memorizes the appearance of spike proteins, which is what it's being exposed to through the current mRNA vaccine regimes, the way the body would remember the shape and qualities of a spike protein may actually be different than how it would remember fighting off an entire virus pathogen filling your body, and that whole rigmarole is maybe be a slightly different pathway than just memorizing the spike proteins as we do with the current mRNA vaccines. But let's assume that it's similar enough that we can have this discussion. So the idea would have been that because the immunity that is passed on to people who have the vaccine is short-lived, okay, then everybody needs to get vaccinated at once. And then for that period of time, which might be 6 months or 9 months, however long the immunity lasts, right? The virus has no corner to hide in. There's nowhere to go. Every time it jumps from one host to another, it finds a host that can fight it off. And so it bounces around a little more, and then it just dies. It just fails to reproduce. It's killed off immediately. It can't spread to another host, and it just fails. It just burns out. That's the way pandemics would normally end if the body can recall having experienced the pathogen. You wouldn't have to coordinate vaccines and things. You could just have herd immunity. Everyone could get sick if it took 2 years or 5 years. It wouldn't even matter because the immunity is lifelong, and eventually the virus would be trying to go through the population, but it can't find anybody who hasn't had the virus, and it just dies out, burns itself out. But the coronavirus is different. Now, I mentioned that these coronaviruses, because the immunity is not lasting, they have a different fate than to just burn out completely and leave the population entirely. Their fate is different. Their fate is to become the common cold, as a rule. So there are something like, well, the common cold is a kind of a common vernacular. We use it in discussions, but it's really a catch-all. It's a big basin that holds really hundreds, probably, certainly scores of different types of pathogens that come under the rubric of the common cold. These are viruses that cause. They're all slightly different, but they give you some or all of the symptoms of a common cold for about all the same amount of time, with about the same amount of harm to the organism, meaning us. Okay, and what are the symptoms? It's runny nose, it's a fever, it's a sore throat, it's malaise, it's a cloudy thinking, it's sleepiness. Okay, what upset stomach, whatever. But it's not harmful. It's annoying, and they tell you to stay home It's good for you to rest, but it's also good for you not to spread the pathogen. So stay home, rest, drink plenty of fluids, take bare aspirin, that whole thing. And then you feel better. And you got over it, your body fought it off, and you won't get sick again this year, right? Because the immunity you just acquired for that particular pathogen, which may not be the only pathogen making it the rounds of your community, okay, you're fine now. You got sick, now you're better, and you won't get sick again because your body has seen this pathogen and you're fine. You can still get another cold, all right? You can get another cold, so-called, from a completely different pathogen that your body hasn't seen this year. And then, of course, by next year, all of the rule sets that your body learned during the previous cold and flu season have been forgotten. And so next year comes around, and for the most part, you're susceptible to the cold and the cold bugs. And the bugs might not even be the same in a following year. They could be a completely different bug, completely different virus. There's like 30 or more coronaviruses that are currently make the rounds of humans routinely. There's like a half dozen that are fairly common. So if you got really unlucky, you could get the cold 6 times in 1 year. If 6 completely different coronaviruses show up at your doorstep and you happen to catch them, yeah, sure, you'll be immune to the first one, but then the second one comes along, it's completely different. Your body can't fight it because it hasn't seen it before, so you get sick again. And then there may be a third one shows up in your community. And this is really more likely for you personally if you're a person who travels between countries or cities a lot. So let's say you're a flight attendant or you're a long haul truck driver and you haul across country from New Jersey to San Diego on your truck, and your truck stopping at truck stops. You're doing all these things. So if that's your profile, that you move around a lot and you see lots of different people in lots of different places, especially if you travel internationally, then you might pick up all kinds of pathogens that don't look familiar to you in the course of a year. There's, in addition to coronaviruses, there's rhinoviruses. A rhino means nose. Okay, so there's head colds, this kind of stuff up here. There's a whole bunch of rhinoviruses, and then there's a whole set of pathogens that are called. I had to look this up. I didn't even know this before I looked it up. Called RSV or para-influenza. So they're influenza-like things. Now, it's important to mention now that I'm talking about the common cold. So coronaviruses give you the common cold. Well, not the current one. COVID-19 gives you COVID-19, which is a whole nother set of symptoms, not quite in the same family of symptoms as common cold. Okay, COVID-19 is not the common cold. All right, we're not there yet. But rhinoviruses, established coronaviruses, and these para-influenza are the common cold. Okay, these are not the flu. The flu is influenza, not even para-influenza. Influenza. Influenza is really dangerous. The flu can kill you. But the immunity you acquire to influenza actually lasts a long time. So in contrast to coronavirus and rhinovirus, where there's so many of them, and the immunity you acquire even from a vaccination doesn't necessarily last all that long, they've never bothered coming up with a vaccine. There's just too many candidates, and it's too hard to make. Now that they're perfecting these mRNA things, maybe they'll actually look at that again. Maybe they'll think about coming up with a vaccine to the common cold. Well, for the coronavirus component of the types of bugs that give us the common cold. Okay, there's also rhinoviruses, para-influenza, and there's also, by the way, there's also a whole bunch, there's like 10 to 20% of colds, common colds that people get, aren't any of those things. It's like, what is this? Wow, something from space, who knows, right? So even for the things they know, it would be hard to come up with vaccines that would, because you can't really get lasting immunity anyway. And then there's a whole bunch of other things they don't even know what it is. So it's the common cold, because the symptoms are just an inconvenience. It's really not worth investing hundreds of billions of dollars in coming up with a vaccine for the common cold. It's just not worth it. But influenza is different. And they do have, it's a whole nother. The flu vaccine and making the flu vaccine is probably, from what little I know about, I'm not an immunologist, okay, but from what little I've been able to glean from discussions, the whole flu vaccine thing is a level of science, you know, uh, vaccine science that's just off the charts. They work so hard at this. It is so hard to do. There is so much science. The whole planet is involved in coming up with these annual flu vaccines. It's an entire industry. It's almost like a war industry. Okay, they have a massive annual mobilization to fight the flu, and some years they do better than others because even the flu, even influenza, is all over the map. But the impacts from influenza are severe enough that they go to the trouble, and it's even possible because the immunity you receive from an influenza vaccine can last long enough to get you through the entire year, and maybe even two. Okay, so but the coronavirus is a whole nother kettle of fish, and these things really escape vaccines. They're very because our body just doesn't work with the vaccine very well. So I'm saying all this, and I suppose Big Pharma will come along and take my YouTube video down. But that's just the science. It's just the acquired immunity doesn't last very long. That's why people are getting boosters. That's why the booster thing is now such a big deal. Yeah, there's a reason for that. But it kind of doesn't matter. And here's why it doesn't matter. A coronavirus pandemic, it sows the seeds of its own destruction. The coronavirus, well, any virus really, speaking strictly of viruses right now, what they really are is they're parasites. They're parasites. They don't intend to kill you. They don't even intend to get you sick. What they intend to do is use you to reproduce. They're going to take your biological system and make up the fact that they don't have a reproductive system, and they're going to use you to reproduce. Okay, that's just how genetics works. Things that can reproduce will, and things that will reproduce will spread, and then you'll see them in future generations. And that's how life is. Life will find a way, right? That's how they say, right? Life will find a way. But there's no advantage in these pathogens killing you or even making you sick. In fact, there's a huge disadvantage. It is maladaptive for it to cause you great harm and or death. And if you understand evolution or what these things have to accomplish to be reproduced, then you'll understand why that's true. Okay? Now let me give you an extreme example of something that is 100% lethal quickly. Okay? And as a contrast, and that's Ebola and Marburg. These aren't even viruses, but they're still pathogen-like entities, and they can still cause illness and death, and they can spread between humans. So we'll throw them in the conversation. Now, Ebola, I'm just going to say 100% lethal. It's not. The variants of Ebola can be anywhere from 50% lethal to 80% to 100%. But anyway, even 50% is really bad news. Now, that's a problem for the pathogen. So let's look at this, right? Since Ebola is so lethal, in theory, as soon as you get sick with it, you die, and you can't spread the virus because we spread viruses through rubbing our eyes and coughing in our hand and coughing into the air, and that's how we spread pathogens, right? Well, actually, Ebola is not spread that way. Ebola is spread through contact. People get it from animals that have Ebola by eating their meat and not cooking it correctly, and humans get it from other humans by coming in contact with their bodies. Ebola is very physically destructive, and your body bleeds. It's really ugly. Okay, you die, and you die of hemorrhaging. It's called hemorrhagic fever. Is another word for is the common term for it, hemorrhagic fever, and you bleed. And so the way that Ebola spreads is it actually spreads faster if it kills you quicker, because the way it spreads is through blood. So it kills you quick, makes you bleed out. Then your compatriots, your families, your friends, your local doctors, your local healthcare people, they come and tend to you. They're either treating your symptoms or they have to bury you. And then they come in contact with the virus in your fluids, on your skin, and then they get the virus. Okay, so the faster Ebola can kill you and make you bleed out and have people tend to your corpse, the faster it can spread to the next person. That's how it does it. And so something like Ebola wants to be as lethal as possible. It wants to spread quickly and kill you quickly so that you can very quickly bleed out and very quickly contaminate the next person down the line. So that's one extreme of how these things evolve to spread. Ebola wants to kill you because it spreads when you're dead. You understand that? It's very important you know that. Coronavirus is exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. So is influenza to a large extent. It's exactly the opposite. You don't really spread the virus when you're dead. You spread the virus when you're coughing, you're breathing, you're talking, you're traveling around your community. You're coughing and you're going into the store, and you're coughing and you're going to the doctor, and then you're coughing and you're at the bus stop going back home, and and that's how it spreads. Now, if it killed you the first day, boom, you're dead. Well, then maybe you cough a little bit and then you're dead, and so it can't spread. It just screwed up. It just totally screwed up. It could have waited 3 days. It could have waited a week, but no, it had to kill you right away. And that's just total screw up, because if you're not walking around for 10 days or a week, coughing and shaking hands with people and coughing and serving food and shopping, and if you're not allowed to do that, then the virus dies, because it's a respiratory virus. It's not a blood virus. It's not bloodborne. It's not spreading in the meat when you eat it. It's respiratory. You have to breathe it out, cough it out. So the ultimate destination of these things, as they spread through the population, is that the versions of the virus, the variants of the virus that are really dangerous, very lethal, kill themselves off. Basically, they screw it up. They're supposed to let you wander around, coughing and sneezing and shaking hands and sharing space with people, but they didn't. They got greedy and they just killed you. You got sick, 6 hours later, you're dead. Well, that virus is finished. That virus is done. But another variant that comes along, maybe it's highly contagious, and shaking hands and coughing and just breathing maybe is sufficient. It spreads real easily. But if it's a variant that keeps you from showing symptoms right away, and then the symptoms are mild, and then it doesn't really kill you or even get you down, but you just keep doing what you're doing, then that version of the virus is a huge winner. If you never even lay down and get sick, even for a day, then you're up wandering around spreading virus particles all over the place, and that virus is an absolute winner. So it's completely the opposite. These coronaviruses, because they're respiratory viruses and require humans to behave in a certain way for a long period of time, they want to lay low. They want to lay low. And the ones that do that better spread more. And eventually they take over. So what determines the prevalence of a variant is really two things, possibly three, at least two. One of those things is how easily does it spread from one host to another. So if you really have to spew a lot of particles, then that's one type of spread. But if just the breathing in and out, if that can spread particles, then that's a different vector altogether, right? So how easily aerosolized a respiratory virus is depends on how well it can spread. That's a trick it needs to learn. The other thing it has to do is it has to lay low. Okay? Does it lay low? If it lays low, but it's present in your respiratory system and it's just laying low, just hanging out, not really causing any problems. Don't mind me. Nobody here but us chickens. Okay. If it's laying low, then it can also spread really fast, wide through the community. And then the other thing it wants to be is it doesn't want to be remembered. And the coronaviruses as a class are really good at that. You know, if the whole herd, the whole community doesn't acquire herd immunity real fast, then these things can just kind of continue to spread around and around and around. Hi, yeah, I'm back. I know it's been 6 months, but I'm back somehow. I don't know even how this happened, but here I am, and it's good to see you again. And I'll just settle in here, and we'll just have a 10, 15 days of symptoms, and you'll spread some virus around, and see you on the next side. Okay, see you on the flip side. And it just keeps going through the community. Now, all the time that it's doing this, it's being constantly groomed by evolution to spread easier, okay, to have fewer symptoms, to knock you down less, to escape your immune system better, okay? And so that's how these things evolve. They don't evolve to become more and more lethal, and more dangerous, and more people dying, and bodies in the streets, and all this stuff. That's not what they do. They do exactly the opposite. And that's why we have all these different coronaviruses that are now responsible for the common cold, so-called, because it's common. Right? So you can imagine that all the coronaviruses that are now making the rounds every year and giving everybody sniffles and sneezes and I got to be home today, I'm not feeling well, and I'll be back to school tomorrow. That kind of virus, that kind of common cold. Possibly these were terrible pandemics at one time. Probably not global pandemics, because remember now, global pandemic is a phenomenon associated with really a globalization. You could have had a European pandemic, you could have had a Chinese pandemic, you could have had a South Pacific pandemic or an Australian pandemic, but people didn't travel much, and so it would be located to either one continent or a region or some other type of boundaries. Mountain ranges could stop it from spreading, so you might have highly localized epidemics that could be really quite dangerous in the beginning, because the virus hasn't evolved to work with this new host. It spreads easily, but it's way too lethal. And so it has to evolve, and it evolves slowly. I shouldn't say slowly, probably pretty rapidly, actually, as evolution goes. It evolves to become more domesticated. It learns to lay low. It's not as lethal. It strings out the symptoms slowly over time, not just 1 day or 3 days, but 10 days or 15 days. And after it's evolved to be sort of a partner, right? It's still a parasite, but now it's working with us instead of trying to kill us. It's working with us. Well, then, from its little regional place, it can start to spread slowly into other places. And so, yeah, there probably used to be a common cold that was common in Africa, and there was a common cold that was common in northern China, and a different one that was common in southern China. And then there was a common cold that was common in parts of Europe or the UK or Spain or the Mediterranean region or North Africa or South Africa. And they all had their common cold. And then about the time we started getting on ships and sailing here and sailing there and going into this port and going into that island and going over here and trading and bartering and whatnot, markets and everyone collecting things at the market and coming in and leaving and coming in and leaving. And, everybody's regional common cold that had adapted to humans at that place. So it became spread all around. Now we have 30 coronaviruses that are now global. They used to be highly regional, but they got out. They got out same way as we got out. We get on a boat, they get on a boat. We get on an airplane, they get on an airplane. We just spread them all over the place, and it's fine because it's just an annoyance and not even really annoying. It's just an annual thing. You get a cold, you stay home, your nose gets red and your eyes get burning and sore throat, and and maybe it's rhinovirus, or maybe it's coronavirus, or maybe it's these para-influenzas, and heaven forbid it's actual influenza, because that's flu. Okay, you don't want to get the flu, and flu can still kill you. But these common colds, they've adapted. They've adapted to us. We've adapted to them, but mostly they've adapted to us. And you could even make the case, if you wanted to, that one of the reasons that our body doesn't remember these other types of viruses like coronavirus or rhinovirus, the reason the body doesn't remember them is, immunity is a lot of work, and it takes energy, and it takes chemistry, and your body has to establish all of these pathways for immunity. And why bother even being immune to something that frankly isn't that dangerous? Whatever, right? Who cares? So I'm not sure that that's really why there are so many coronaviruses. Like I said, there's at least 24 of them, and there may be more. And why we're not really immune to them in any effective way, except on a short-term basis, because they're kind of just a nuisance. Why bother? Humans didn't evolve a pathway to fight these things other than on the short term, because who cares, right? Now, a novel zoonotic coronavirus like we've just had, COVID-19, so-called, it's a SARS-2, severe acute respiratory syndrome 2, implying there was a 1, and there was. The novel viruses can be quite dangerous because they're not evolved to us. They were evolved to pigs or ducks or pangolins or aardvarks, who knows, right? They were evolved to something, not us. And so when they get in us, it's a big freak out. And you should really imagine it this way. The virus jumps into a new host and says, ooh, I have a new host. Let me look around here, see what I can break, right? And then it finds out that it kills you. And you should really, in the back of your mind, think, oh, darn, that was a mistake, because it is. It doesn't really, that is not to its advantage to be lethal. It should be more like the common cold. And that's exactly what happens. It evolves in that direction until finally it's just one of the common colds in the background of common colds. And instead of having 30, now there's 31. My guess is that some of them kind of fall off eventually, that they keep moving around trying to find new hosts, and then at some point they can't, and they probably go extinct. The same way you would with any other type of, with any animal that, for example, needs to find new habitat. Some migratory animal can't find new habitat, and then all of a sudden that animal's extinct. Okay, it's kind of the same idea. They keep randomly running around looking for hosts, but they can't find one that doesn't have immunity, and so that virus, that version of the common cold, that particular variant, goes extinct. So there's probably an equilibrium between the ones that are just getting unlucky and going extinct, or that the body has really learned how to fight them, and the others that are coming in new, the zoonotic origin stories like we're having right now with SARS-2, COVID-19. So that's how a pandemic of this kind ends. It ends in a whimper. Doesn't end in a bang. It ends in a whimper. But it also means that it never really goes away. It's just it doesn't matter anymore. It just joins the pool of the 1,001 things that cause us grief, but not so much grief that we have to do anything about it, or that our bodies even bother doing anything about it. A little bit of grief, a little bit of annoyance, and essentially it's the perfect parasite. It becomes the perfect parasite. It can just sleaze its way into the human population. There's always a host. Even if there's a big outbreak, there's always going to be somebody whose body has forgotten it. And so it can just go back in there and, hey, buddy, I'm back. Don't mind me. And we just have to live with it. So I guess that's the good news. Maybe. the thought that this will be with us, uh, for 1,000 years is probably not very good news. But you have to keep in mind that it learns how to not be a little bitch. Okay, it learns how to get along because that's to its advantage. To lay low, take it easy, don't be in a hurry, don't raise a fuss, don't make anybody stay home, just kind of hang out, be a bro. And that's the lesson. That's how they evolve. That's how they evolve, to just chill. So COVID-19 will eventually learn how to chill. Might take a while, but it will eventually learn that. And then we'll be stuck with it. It's not the worst thing. I think the takeaway here is we do want to avoid zoonotic transmission or lab leaks, depending on what side of the fence you're on. The way we treat animals is atrocious. Our destruction of animal habitat is atrocious. Our relationship with our domesticated animals, how we rear them and how we process them, and our relationship with that whole thing is atrocious. It just is awful. It's just god awful. And if we don't want these types of pandemics, meaning novel coronaviruses, if we don't want novel coronaviruses coming at us through zoonotic, tongue is getting tired, zoonotic transmission, then we need to be, then the lesson is, takeaway is, we need to be more cognizant of how we treat animals. And, oh, by the way, maybe just not interact with animals like that, especially wild animals. And again, the lesson is Ebola. Ebola has a reservoir in monkeys in Africa. I think in monkeys, it's not lethal. So it can make the rounds in monkeys the way the common cold makes it round in us. But when it gets transmitted to humans, again, because we're doing things with monkeys we should not be doing, like eating them, all right, then we humans have a problem, because it's, zoonotic transmission is very, very dangerous, extremely dangerous. It is very dangerous. We actually got kind of lucky with SARS-2, COVID-19. There have been bird flus and swine flus in the past that were not as well behaved, were abundantly lethal. MERS, which is a Middle Eastern version of SARS, hence the ME. MERS, which I think the reservoir was camels, was abundantly lethal. Okay. So fortunately, it burned itself out, right? But the real danger is that something that is abundantly lethal also learns the second trick, which is how to lay low. I mean, that's the nightmare scenario here, folks, that it evolves to lay low, okay? And then it kills you. And when you have science fiction, drama, horror stories where there's a virus making the rounds of the population, it's killing all these people, or turning them into zombies, or, the plot, right? One of the characteristics of such a thing is it lays low for a while, during which time it can spread. So its R value is really high, like R3 or 4 or 5 or 10, R value of 10. But then the lethality sneaks up on you 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, boom, you're dead. Well, yeah, now you're dead, but you had 3 weeks to spread the virus. So now everybody's dead, right? That's the horror story. So there is still a way that these things can lay low. Don't mind me just hanging out. You go about you be you, and I'll just stay here in the background and not make any waves. And then boom, okay. That scenario is bad. And we do want to be careful with that. It is possible that something could have both of those characteristics and not evolve into something that is harmless. That was the real concern with SARS-2, is that it was going to be more like MERS and be super lethal, combined also with spreads real easily, just breathing or light talk or whatever could spread the virus, and also that it would lay low for a long time before finally it killed people. That's the nightmare scenario. That's the science fiction nightmare scenario of virus evolution. Lethality is a function of the virus. SARS-2 is not highly lethal. It just isn't. Highly lethal would be like bubonic plague, where it killed a third to half of the population and also spread very easily. Okay, bubonic plague was a nightmare because it was so lethal and it spread so easily, and it laid low for so long that it was murderous. Killed half of Europe. So that's the real nightmare scenario. And when we first started dealing with SARS-2, COVID-19, as they now call it, we didn't know where this thing was going to fall. Well, it turned out it wasn't that lethal. It would make you sick enough that you would seek hospitalization, and the hospital system was overwhelmed. But that's a logistics problem, right? Set your expectations accordingly, and maybe that isn't a problem. But as for lethality, bodies in the streets, didn't really happen. So we got lucky. Won't always. So we need to be careful how we deal with animals. Animals we're going to eat, animals we're going to live with, animals we're going to handle, sell, ride, pull plows with, whatever we're going to do with our animals. We need to be real careful how we treat our animals. Don't let them get sick. If they get sick, deal with it. Isolate them. Don't let these things spread. Definitely don't sit on it. If it's starting to break out in your community, definitely deal with it. Do a lockdown if you need to. Destroy a herd if you need to. Keep these things from becoming unwieldy. We need to do that. That's our responsibility. Or we might get something that's a true nightmare. I believe that this SARS-2 is destined to become something similar to the common cold, along with all the other hundreds of pathogens that use us opportunistically as hosts to reproduce themselves and only give you a sniffle or a sore throat in the process. Okay, I think that's where this is headed. That seems to be what the data suggests. But don't kid yourself, okay? We dodged the bullet with this one, I do believe. Maybe not so much the next time. So when we do the post-mortem on this and we look back at it and say, what could we have done differently? Take it seriously. We do need to do things differently. We are too many on this planet. The planet is too sick from our being here in the numbers we are here. And we are pushing animals very hard, destroying their habitat, pushing them together. We're even artificially collecting them and putting them in really unsafe collections in zoos and in meat markets and everything else. We need to very, very carefully monitor that. Okay. More work is needed here. Absolutely more work is needed here. The WHO, the World Health Organization, that's kind of their wheelhouse. So let's support them to do that for us. And for our part, we all need to be very careful how we manage animals, in particular, wild animals. So that's all I have to say on that. Hope I'm right.